Wheelchair-bound girl abandoned by her stepfather. 2 days later, she returns to her fake wake, staged by him, and reveals something shocking. Subscribe to my channel and comment if you have children so I can learn more about you. The wind howled through the windows of the old Victorian house as Emily watched the rain fall on the other side of the glass. Her small fingers traced patterns on the fogged-up surface, but her gaze was lost somewhere far away in the garden. It had been exactly a month since her mother passed away, taken by a sudden aneurysm that no one could have predicted. The 10-year-old could still smell the sweet perfume her mother used to wear, still hear her laughter echoing through the halls of the house. The wheelchair creaked slightly as she turned away from the window. Since she was a child, a degenerative disease had prevented her from walking, but her mother had always done everything to ensure she had a normal life. Susan, her mother, had built a supermarket empire in upstate New York, starting with a small corner store and turning it into a respected chain across the region. All this work, she always said, was to ensure that Emily would never have to worry about anything. Heavy footsteps in the hallway made Emily instinctively shrink. She knew that sound well. Roger's leather boots always announced his arrival before he even appeared. The door to the room creaked open. "Still in here moping?" His voice was harsh, filled with a contempt he didn't even try to hide. "Isn't it time to get over it?" Emily didn't answer. She had learned that silence was her best defense against the man her mother had chosen to share her life with, a man who, from day one, had made it clear that he saw her as a burden, an obstacle between him and Susan's fortune. The lawyer was here today. Roger approached, stopping beside the wheelchair. His strong artificial cologne made Emily's stomach churn. "Looks like your mother left everything to you. What a surprise, huh?" The sarcasm in his voice was cutting. "But guess what? I'm your legal guardian until you turn 18. Do you know what that means?" Emily kept her eyes fixed on the window, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to fall. She knew exactly what that meant. She was completely at the mercy of this man for the next 8 years. "Look at me when I'm talking to you!" Roger grabbed the arm of the wheelchair, turning it sharply so she would face him. His eyes, normally cold, now shone with something Emily had never seen before, a mixture of anger and triumph that made her heart race with fear. "We're going for a drive," he announced suddenly, a strange smile forming on his thin lips. "It's a beautiful night for a ride in the countryside, don't you think?" "I don't want to go," Emily replied in a small voice, feeling a shiver run down her spine. "It's raining too much." It wasn't a request. Roger began pushing the chair towards the door. "Besides, a little fresh air will do you good. You're too pale. You look like a ghost." The word ghost made Emily shudder. There was something in the way he pronounced it that sounded like a veiled threat. As she was wheeled through the halls of the house, past pictures of happy moments with her mother, a sense of dread began to overwhelm her. "Martha!" Roger called out to the housekeeper who had worked in the house for years. "I'm taking Emily for a drive. Don't wait up for dinner." The grey-haired woman appeared in the kitchen doorway, frowning with concern. "But sir, with all this rain, wouldn't it be better to wait for the weather to clear up?" "I already said don't wait up for us." Roger's tone left no room for argument. Martha cast one last worried look at Emily before disappearing back into the kitchen. When they reached the garage, Roger opened the car door and, without any care, transferred Emily to the passenger seat. The wheelchair was tossed into the back seat, and before she could protest, he was already speeding down the road leading out of town. The lights faded behind them, and the darkness of the night swallowed the car. The rain continued to fall, harder and harder, turning the dirt road into a treacherous mud pit. Emily watched the droplets stream down the glass, feeling her heart beat faster and faster as they drove further and further away from civilization. "Where are you taking me?" she finally managed to ask, her trembling voice almost inaudible over the sound of the rain. Roger didn't answer. His face, illuminated only by the dashboard, was contorted into an expression that made Emily wish she had never asked. They continued driving down the dark road, each mile increasing the terror growing inside her. After what seemed like an eternity, the car began to slow down. There was nothing around but empty fields and a few wind-twisted trees. Roger stopped the car and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. "You know, Emily," he began, his voice strangely calm, "sometimes life presents us with problems that need to be eliminated." Emily's heart felt like it was going to leap out of her chest as Roger got out of the car, walking around to her door. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, turning everything into blurry shadows in the darkness. With a brusque movement, he opened the door and picked her up in his arms, without any gentleness. "Please," she begged, tears mixing with the rainwater that was now soaking her face, "please don't do this." Roger completely ignored her. He removed the wheelchair from the back seat and placed it on the dirt road, now transformed into mud by the storm. With a push, he sat Emily in the chair, causing her to let out a moan of pain from the sudden movement. "You know what's the most interesting thing?" he asked, leaning down until his face was inches from hers. "No one's going to miss you. Everyone will think it was an accident, a tragedy. The poor orphaned girl who couldn't cope with her mother's death and ran away on a stormy night." Emily trembled uncontrollably, not only from the cold rain that had already soaked her clothes, but from the terror that gripped every fiber of her being. Roger's smile, illuminated by the car headlights, was something she knew she would never forget. "You can't do this," she tried to argue, her voice failing. "Martha knows we left together. She will." "Martha?" Roger let out a dry laugh. "That old woman won't last long in this job. As soon as I get back, I'm firing her. After all, what kind of housekeeper lets a child go out alone on a stormy night?" With a strong shove, he pushed the wheelchair away from the edge of the road. The wheels sank into the mud, causing Emily to lose her balance. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the deafening sound of thunder. "Goodbye, dear stepdaughter." Roger walked back to the car, his boots leaving deep tracks in the mud. "It was a pleasure knowing you." The roar of the engine gave way to Emily's desperate cries. She begged, called out for her mother, prayed to God that someone would hear her. But there was only the silence of the night and the sound of the rain answering her pleas. The taillights faded into the distance until they disappeared completely, leaving her alone in complete darkness. The minutes dragged on like hours. The rain didn't let up, and the biting wind made her teeth chatter. Her clothes were completely soaked, clinging to her fragile body like a second icy skin. Emily tried to move the chair, but the wheels only sank further into the mud. Fear gave way to absolute despair. She thought of her mother, how she always said that God never gives us a burden greater than we can bear. But at that moment, alone in the middle of nowhere, Emily couldn't find the strength to believe it. The night wore on, bringing with it an even more intense cold. Her fingers were numb, and she could barely feel her legs. Fatigue began to weigh on her eyelids, but she struggled to keep her eyes open. She was afraid to fall asleep and never wake up. From time to time, a nocturnal animal made a sound that made her jump. Each noise, each movement in the shadows, fueled her terror. She tried to focus on the stories her mother told her before bed, on the afternoons they spent together in the garden, on any memory that could keep her conscious. The hours dragged on. The rain finally began to subside, but the cold only increased. Emily felt her whole body ache, and her throat was so dry that she could barely swallow. Hunger began to gnaw, making her stomach rumble painfully. When the first rays of sunlight began to tint the horizon, she was already on the verge of exhaustion. Her skin, normally pale, had a bluish tone from the cold. Her lips, cracked from thirst, bled slightly. Still, she refused to give up. The day dawned slowly, revealing the desolation around her. Empty fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted only by a few twisted trees. There were no houses, no paved roads, just that dirt road that snaked until it disappeared into the horizon. The sun rose in the sky, and with it came a suffocating heat. The same rain that had almost frozen her during the night now evaporated, turning the air into a humid furnace. Her skin began to burn, scorched by the merciless rays of the sun. The thirst became unbearable. Her tongue felt like a piece of old leather inside her mouth, and each breath burned her parched throat. Emily tried to lick the dew that still remained on the leaves within her reach, but it was hardly enough to alleviate her suffering. The hours dragged on, and no cars passed by. From time to time, she mustered the strength to shout for help, but her voice was no more than a hoarse whisper. The heat and thirst were draining her last energies, and for the first time since she had been abandoned, Emily began to accept that she might not survive. She thought of Martha, the only person who had shown concern before her departure. Had she noticed anything strange? Was anyone looking for her? Or had Roger already convinced everyone that she had run away, distraught over her mother's death? The sun began to set again, bringing with it the promise of another freezing night. Emily didn't know if she had the strength to endure another night like the previous one. Her eyes were heavy, and her mind was beginning to get confused. The shadows around her seemed to dance, taking on strange shapes. It was then that a distant noise caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just another hallucination caused by exhaustion and thirst, but the sound was getting louder. It was definitely an engine. A light began to approach on the road, cutting through the twilight. With the last of her strength, Emily tried to scream. Her voice came out as a hoarse moan, almost inaudible. The vehicle approached slowly, and she could see that it was an old pickup truck covered in mud. Her heart began to beat faster. Would it be salvation or more danger? The pickup truck stopped a few yards away and the engine was turned off. The door creaked open and a male figure got out of the vehicle. Emily felt the fear grow again in her chest. In her experience, men like Roger only brought pain and suffering. The stranger began to walk towards her, and she tried to shrink into her chair, wishing she could disappear. The twilight revealed a middle-aged man, with graying hair and a face marked by deep wrinkles. His eyes, however, had something different from Roger's. There was a gentleness in them that she wasn't used to seeing. The man stopped a few steps from Emily, his eyes scanning the scene with an expression that mixed concern and disbelief. The girl tried to move away, but the wheels of her chair only sank further into the dry mud. Her heart was beating so hard that it felt like it wanted to escape from her chest. "Good heavens," he murmured, his voice rough and carrying a slight country accent. "What happened to you, child?" Emily didn't answer. Her throat was so dry that she could barely swallow, and years of living with Roger had taught her to distrust any apparent kindness. The man took another step towards her, and she instinctively raised her arms in a weak attempt to protect herself. "You don't have to be afraid," he said, stopping where he was. "My name is Frank. I'm just an old man who lives nearby. I won't hurt you." There was something in the way he spoke, a softness that vaguely reminded her of her mother, that made Emily lower her guard a little. Still, when he tried to approach again, she let out a frightened moan. Okay, Frank backed away, raising his hands in a peaceful gesture. "I'll stay here where I am, but you need help, that I can see. You're all sunburned, dehydrated." The sun was almost disappearing on the horizon, and a cold breeze began to blow. Emily trembled, her body still remembering the terror of the previous night. Frank noticed her discomfort and took off the jacket he was wearing, holding it out to her. "You can take it," he said, leaving the jacket on the ground between them. "It's starting to get cold." Emily looked at the jacket and then at Frank, the distrust still evident in her eyes. He sighed deeply and sat down on the ground, keeping his distance. "You know, I had a daughter," he began, his voice faltering slightly. "Her name was Annie. She was about your age when God took her. It's been 5 years now." Something in the way he spoke, the genuine pain in his voice, touched something inside Emily. She knew that kind of pain. It was the same she felt when she thought of her mother. Since then, I've lived alone in a small house nearby, Frank continued, gesturing vaguely towards the horizon. It's nothing fancy, but it has food, clean water, a warm place to sleep. You can stay there until you recover if you want. The mention of water made Emily's stomach churn. Her thirst was so intense that it hurt, but years of abuse had taught her not to trust easily. What if it was a trap? What if he was like Roger? Here, Frank pulled a bottle of water from his pants pocket. You must be very thirsty. You can take it. It's still sealed. He rolled the bottle across the ground until it stopped near Emily's chair. With trembling hands, she took the bottle, checking that it was indeed sealed. Her thirst was greater than her fear at that moment, and she drank avidly, feeling the cool water soothe her parched throat. Slow down, Frank warned gently. You'll end up getting sick if you drink too fast. Emily slowed down, but didn't stop drinking until she emptied the bottle. When she finished, she realized that Frank was watching her with an expression that mixed concern and something that seemed to be anger. Who did this to you? He asked, his voice now filled with a seriousness that wasn't there before. Who would be capable of abandoning a child in the middle of nowhere? Tears began to stream down Emily's face before she could stop them. All the terror of the last hours, all the despair and loneliness came to the surface at once. Her sobs echoed through the night that was beginning to fall. Frank waited patiently for her to calm down, maintaining the distance she clearly needed. When her sobs subsided, he spoke again, his voice soft. You don't have to tell me now if you don't want to. But it's getting dark, and it's going to be very cold. I can't leave you here. Please let me help you. Emily looked at the sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. The prospect of spending another night there was terrifying. Slowly, she nodded. Frank got up slowly, picked up the jacket from the ground, and approached carefully. When she didn't flinch, he gently placed the jacket over her shoulders. It was too big for her, but it was warm and had a pleasant smell of coffee and wood smoke. I'm going to need to carry you to the truck, okay? He asked, keeping his voice calm. Your chair is stuck in the mud, but I promise I'll come back to get it tomorrow. Emily hesitated for a moment, but then nodded yes. Frank picked her up in his arms, with a gentleness that she didn't expect from such calloused hands. He carried her to the truck and settled her in the passenger seat carefully, as if she were made of porcelain. The interior of the vehicle was simple but clean, and there was a pleasant smell of coffee that vaguely reminded her of mornings with her mother. Frank started the engine and the heater, and the warm air that began to circulate made Emily realize how cold she was. As the pickup truck moved slowly down the dirt road, Emily struggled against the sleep that was beginning to overwhelm her. The warmth of the heater, the gentle rocking of the vehicle, and the exhaustion of the last hours made it increasingly difficult to keep her eyes open. You can sleep, she heard Frank say softly. You're safe now. There was still a part of her that wanted to resist, that screamed not to trust anyone, but her body couldn't take it anymore. Her eyes closed against her will, and for the first time in a long time, Emily allowed herself to rest. Frank drove in silence, casting worried glances at the sleeping girl beside him. Her sunburned face, her cracked lips, the tear tracks on her dirty cheeks, all this told a story that made his blood boil. In his years as a cop, he had seen a lot of cruelty, but abandoning a disabled child in the middle of nowhere, that was a new level of evil. The pickup truck continued down the dark road, its headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Frank gripped the steering wheel tighter, a determination growing in his chest. He didn't know exactly what had happened to that girl, but one thing he was sure of: he wouldn't allow her to suffer any more harm. Frank's house was small and simple, but it had a cozy sense of home that Emily hadn't felt since her mother's death. When she woke up the next morning, she was lying in a soft bed, covered by several colorful blankets that smelled of lavender. The room was modest, decorated only with an old dresser and some photographs on the wall. Her eyes scanned the room, lingering on a particular photo. In it, a girl smiled while embracing Frank. They both looked so happy that it made Emily's heart clench. That must have been Annie, the daughter he had mentioned. The door opened softly, and Frank entered carrying a tray. The smell of coffee and homemade bread made Emily's stomach rumble audibly. "Good morning," he said with a gentle smile. "I figured you were hungry. I made a simple breakfast, but it's made with love." Emily watched as he placed the tray on a small table beside the bed. There was coffee with milk, still warm bread, butter, and a plate of scrambled eggs. It was a simple meal, but for someone who hadn't eaten in more than a day, it seemed like a feast. "You can eat," Frank encouraged, sitting down in a chair nearby. "You must be famished." With hands still trembling, Emily picked up a piece of bread. The first bite was like tasting a piece of heaven. The bread was warm and soft, and she couldn't hold back the tears that began to stream down her face. "Hey, it's okay," Frank said softly, offering a tissue. "You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you." Emily accepted the tissue, but continued eating in silence. Frank didn't pressure her, just stood there, a quiet and comforting presence. When she finished eating, he removed the tray and returned with a basin of warm water and some clean towels. "I thought you might like to freshen up a bit," he explained. "There's an adapted bathroom down the hall. It was Annie's. She also used a wheelchair." It was then that Emily noticed for the first time that there were grab bars on the walls of the room and that the door was wider than normal. This room had been prepared for someone like her. "What happened to her?" Emily asked, her voice still hoarse. Frank sat down again, his eyes fixed on a distant point. "It was a car accident. I was driving. It was a rainy night like yesterday." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Annie was paralyzed. We lived together for 3 more years. I adapted the whole house for her. But then came a bad case of pneumonia, and she didn't make it." The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Emily could see the pain in Frank's eyes, the same pain she felt when she thought of her mother. "My mother died a month ago," she found herself saying, the words coming out before she could stop them. "It was very fast. One day she was fine, the next—" "And your father?" Frank asked gently. "I never knew my father." Emily began to fidget with the edge of the blanket. "But there was Roger, my stepfather. He—" Her voice failed, and the tremors returned in full force. Frank waited patiently, his face a mask of concern. When Emily finally managed to calm down, he spoke with a firm but gentle voice. "He's the one who left you on that road, wasn't he?" Emily nodded, the tears returning in full force. Between sobs, she began to tell him everything, about how her mother had built a supermarket chain, about how Roger had appeared in their lives 3 years ago, about how he had always treated her with coldness and contempt. "After Mom died, he changed," she continued, her voice trembling. "He became colder, more cruel. Yesterday, when he found out that Mom had left everything to me—" She couldn't finish the sentence, the sobs taking over again. Frank stood up abruptly, his fists clenched so tightly that his knuckles were white. He walked to the window, trying to control the anger that was boiling in his blood. "That bastard," he muttered through his teeth, "abandoning a child to steal her inheritance." "He's going to say I ran away," Emily said softly. "He's going to say I couldn't handle Mom's death and ran away during the storm." Frank turned to her, his eyes shining with a fierce determination. "I'm not going to let that happen. I was a police officer for 20 years before I retired. I know how to deal with people like him." "No!" Emily cried, the panic evident in her voice. "He's dangerous. If he finds out I'm alive—" "Listen," Frank approached, kneeling beside the bed to be at her eye level. "I need you to trust me now, to tell me everything, every detail. We're going to do this the right way, with evidence, with witnesses. He won't get away with this." Emily looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of a lie or falsehood, as she was used to seeing in Roger's eyes. But she only found sincerity and a determination that made her feel, for the first time since her mother's death, truly protected. The following hours were spent with Frank, listening attentively as Emily recounted every detail of the last years living with Roger. She talked about how he always treated her with disdain when her mother wasn't around, about the small daily cruelties, about how he began to change after Susan's death. Martha, our housekeeper, she saw when we left, Emily remembered. She seemed worried, but Roger scared her. This Martha, Frank asked, making notes in a notebook. Has she worked for you long? Since before I was born, Emily replied. She practically raised me along with Mom, but Roger said he was going to fire her. He won't get a chance, Frank assured her. First, we need to ensure your safety. Then we're going to gather evidence and witnesses. Martha could be an important ally. As the day progressed, Emily began to feel the fatigue weigh on her again. Frank noticed and insisted that she rest a little longer. I'll prepare something for lunch, he said, getting up. Afterward, if you're feeling better, we can take a walk in the yard. There's a small garden out back. It's nothing fancy, but Annie loved spending her afternoons there. When Frank left the room, Emily allowed herself to relax a little. Her eyes scanned the photographs on the wall again, stopping at the image of Annie. There was something comforting in knowing that this room, this house, had been a happy home for someone like her. Outside, she could hear Frank moving around in the kitchen, the sound of pots and pans and the smell of home cooking filling the house. It was a kind of normalcy that she hadn't experienced in a long time, not since before her mother's death. But even in this moment of apparent peace, a shadow hung over her thoughts. Somewhere, Roger was probably planning how to convince everyone of her supposed escape. How long would it take for him to find out she was alive, and what would he do when he did? A shiver ran down her spine at the thought of it. But then she heard Frank's voice humming softly in the kitchen, and something inside her calmed down. Maybe, just maybe, she had found not only a savior, but also a protector. Back in the small town in upstate New York, Emily's disappearance was causing a stir. Roger had contacted the police early that morning, playing the role of a concerned stepfather to perfection. His fake tears and choked voice convinced even the most skeptical. She was so distraught over her mother's death, he told the police, running his hands over his face in a studied display of distress. Last night, when I went to check on her, the room was empty. The wheelchair was also gone. My God, she must have left during the storm. Martha watched everything from the kitchen, her heart aching. Something about that story didn't make sense. She remembered clearly seeing Roger leave with Emily the night before, but when she tried to mention this to the police, he promptly interrupted her. Martha is confused, he said with a condescending smile. She's getting old, you know how it is. Besides, she's fired. I can't keep a housekeeper who didn't notice a child leaving alone during a storm. The gray-haired woman felt the tears stream down her wrinkled face. Something terrible had happened to Emily, she was sure. But who would believe a domestic worker against the word of a respected businessman? Meanwhile, miles away, Emily was beginning to adapt to the routine at Frank's house. The days passed slowly, marked by small progress. Her sunburns were beginning to heal, and her trust in her savior grew with each shared meal, each quiet conversation in the garden. Frank had fulfilled his promise and rescued her wheelchair from the road. After a good cleaning and some adjustments, it was once again in usable condition. For Emily, it was like regaining a piece of her independence. You know, Frank commented one afternoon while watering the plants in the small garden, Annie loved these flowers. She said they were like people, each with their own personality, their own strength. Emily watched from the porch, protected from the strong sun by an awning. There was something deeply comforting in the way Frank spoke of his daughter, not with the heavy sadness that she used to see in her mother's eyes when she mentioned her father, but with a sweet, almost joyful longing. What was she like? Emily found herself asking. Annie, I mean. Frank set down the watering can and sat down in a nearby chair. She was pure light, he said with a soft smile. Even after the accident, Even on the toughest days, she always found a reason to smile. She said life was too precious to be wasted on sadness. "My mother was like that too," Emily commented, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "She always said that no matter what happened, there was always a reason to be grateful." "Dee, your mother seemed to be a very special woman," Frank observed gently. "She was." Emily felt the tears forming in her eyes. "Sometimes I wake up thinking it was all a nightmare, that I'll find her in the kitchen, preparing that coffee with milk that only she knew how to make the way I like it." Frank reached out, offering a tissue. Emily accepted it, realizing that she no longer flinched when he approached. It was strange how, in such a short time, this man had become such a comforting presence in her life. But the peace of that moment was interrupted by the distant sound of a car approaching. Frank immediately became alert, standing up to check who it was. Emily felt her heart race. Would it be Roger's men? "Stay calm," Frank whispered, noticing her panic. "I'll see who it is. You go inside and lock the door, okay?" Emily nodded, her hands trembling as she maneuvered the chair into the house. Frank waited until he heard the click of the lock before walking to the gate. It was just the mailman, delivering some flyers and the local paper. But when Frank opened the newspaper, his blood ran cold. On the front page, there was a photo of Emily smiling next to her mother, and just below it the headline, "Family Tragedy. Supermarket Heiress Disappears During Storm." The article detailed how the girl, still shaken by the recent death of her mother, had apparently run away during the night. Roger was quoted several times, his statements filled with a concern that Frank knew to be false. "The police are searching," one of the quotes read. "But with that wheelchair in this weather, only God knows what may have happened to my dear stepdaughter." Frank crumpled the newspaper in anger. The staging was perfect. Roger had created a convincing story, supported by his social position and the recent history of family trauma. Who would question the word of a dedicated stepfather, worried about the disappearance of his stepdaughter? Inside the house, Emily waited anxiously. When Frank returned, she immediately realized that something was wrong. He tried to hide the newspaper, but she insisted on seeing it. "He's lying," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she read the article. "It's all a lie." "I know, kiddo." Frank knelt beside her chair. "But this only proves that we need to be even more careful. He's building a story, preparing the ground for when I turn up dead," Emily completed, her voice trembling. "That's what he wants everyone to think, isn't it? That I ran away and ended up dying somewhere." Frank felt his heart clench at the cruel lucidity of that child. At just 10 years old, she already understood the depths of human wickedness in a way that no child should. "I'm not going to let that happen," he promised, his voice filled with determination. "But we need to be smart. He has money, he has influence. We'll need concrete evidence before we can act." That night, after Emily finally fell asleep, Frank stayed awake for hours, planning his next steps. As a former police officer, he knew that they would need more than just Emily's word against Rogers. They would need evidence, witnesses. His thoughts were interrupted by a scream coming from Emily's room. He ran to it, finding her sitting on the bed, trembling and bathed in sweat. "He was here," she sobbed, looking frantically around. "Roger, he found me. It was just a nightmare." Frank hugged her gently, feeling her small body tremble. "You're safe here. I promise." While calming Emily, Frank felt his determination grow. This girl had already suffered too much. It was time to act. The next day, he would begin to put his plan into practice. First, he needed to find Martha. The former housekeeper could be a crucial witness. Then he would investigate Roger's past. Men like him always left traces of their misdeeds. What Frank didn't know was that at that very moment, Roger was also making plans. In his office in town, he examined a map of the region, systematically marking each area where a wheelchair could have reached during the storm. "I need to be sure," he murmured to himself, his eyes shining with a sickly obsession. I need to be sure that she didn't survive. The full moon illuminated the two contrasting scenes. In a simple house in the countryside, a man protected a frightened child, promising justice. In a luxurious office in town, another man planned to ensure that his crimes remained hidden. The confrontation was inevitable. The only question was when and how it would happen. The days in the small town dragged on under a suffocating heat. Martha walked through the streets with slow steps, carrying a nearly empty shopping bag, all she could buy with the little money she had left after being fired. People greeted her with looks of pity, some whispering as soon as she passed. The former housekeeper of the wealthiest family in the region now had to do odd cleaning jobs to survive. She stopped in front of Mr. Anthony's grocery store, where a poster with Emily's picture was pasted on the window. "Help find," the text read in large letters. Below, there was a generous reward offered by Roger for any information about the girl's whereabouts. "May God protect this child," Martha murmured, making the sign of the cross. She knew that something terrible had happened that night, but every time she tried to talk to someone, Roger's words echoed in her mind. Who's going to believe a confused old woman? Meanwhile, at Frank's house, Emily was beginning to show small signs of recovery. Not just physically, but emotionally. Her sunburns had completely healed, and she no longer startled at sudden movements or loud noises. On quiet afternoons in the garden, she sometimes even managed to smile when Frank told stories about his life as a police officer. "You know, kiddo," he said one of those afternoons while pruning some rose bushes, "sometimes good takes a while, but it always wins out in the end. I saw it happen plenty of times when I was working the streets." Emily watched the bees visiting the flowers, her mind wandering between the present and memories of the past. "My mother used to say something like that," she commented softly. "But sometimes it's hard to believe, you know? Especially when—" Her voice failed, and Frank set down the pruning shears, turning all his attention to her. "When what, kiddo?" "When the bad guys seem to be winning all the time," she completed, her hands gripping the arms of the wheelchair. "Roger, he's out there, pretending to be worried about me, making everyone believe he's a good person, while you're here, alive and stronger every day," Frank completed, his voice firm but gentle. "And that, kiddo, is the biggest proof that good wins. You survived. You're here." At that moment, the sound of a car approaching made both of them freeze. Frank quickly pushed Emily's chair into the house, closing the curtains and locking the doors. It was a ritual they had developed, always alert, always prepared. The vehicle passed right by the house, but the moment of peace had been broken. Frank knew they couldn't continue like this forever, living in the shadows, afraid of being discovered. It was time to act. "I need to go into town tomorrow," he announced during dinner. "There are some things we need to take care of." Emily immediately paled. "No," she whispered, the panic evident in her voice. "It's dangerous. If someone follows you, if they find out where I am—" "Kiddo," Frank knelt beside her chair, "trust me, I know what I'm doing. I need to find Martha, your former housekeeper. She's an important witness. She saw you leaving together that night." "But Roger fired her," Emily argued. "She must be afraid of him like everyone else." "That's why I need to talk to her in person, to show her that she's not alone, that there's hope for justice." The next morning, Frank prepared to leave. He put on his simplest clothes, took his old pickup truck, and checked 3 times that all the doors and windows were securely locked. "Lock everything as soon as I leave," he instructed Emily. "Don't open for anyone. Don't make any noise. Stay away from the windows. I'll be back before nightfall." Emily nodded, trying to be strong, but her hands trembled as she held the key. When Frank's pickup truck disappeared down the dirt road, she felt an overwhelming loneliness take over her chest. In town, Frank began his search. It wasn't difficult to find out where Martha was living. In a small town like that, everyone knew everything. He found her in a simple neighborhood, in a tiny house at the back of a property. Martha was in the yard, hanging clothes on the clothesline, when Frank approached. Seeing him, she immediately tensed up. "Mrs. Martha?" he called softly. "My name is Frank. We need to talk about Emily." The girl's name made Martha drop the clothespin she was holding. "I don't know anything," she replied quickly, looking around as if searching for an escape route. "I already spoke with the police. There's nothing more to say." "You saw them leave that night, didn't you?" Frank insisted, keeping his voice low. "You saw Roger taking her in the wheelchair." Martha stopped moving, her hands gripping the wet sheet tightly. "How do you know that?" "Because she told me." Frank took a step forward, lowering his voice even further. "She's alive, Mrs. Martha." "She's safe." Martha's legs buckled, and Frank quickly supported her, helping her sit on a nearby bench. Tears began to stream down the old woman's wrinkled face. "My girl," she sobbed. "My little Emily is alive. Are you sure?" Meanwhile, at Frank's house, Emily tried to keep herself busy to avoid thinking about the danger. She tidied her room, browsed through some old books she found on a shelf, prayed all the prayers her mother had taught her. The sound of a car made her freeze. It wasn't the familiar noise of Frank's pickup truck. It was something more powerful, newer. With her heart pounding, she maneuvered her chair to a point where she could peek through the slit in the curtain without being seen. A black car, imposing, was parked on the road. Inside it, Emily could see a face that made her blood run cold. Roger was there, watching the house with a calculating look. In town, Frank was finishing explaining the situation to Martha. The former housekeeper had cried, prayed, and finally promised to help in any way she could. "That man is the devil himself," she said, her voice now firm with determination. "I always knew there was something wrong with him from day one. The way he looked at the girl, how he treated her when Susan wasn't around." "We need your help, Mrs. Martha," Frank explained. "Your testimony could be crucial to proving that he lied, that he took Emily out of town that night." "I'll do whatever it takes," Martha declared, "for Susan's memory, for my girl." But while they were planning their next steps, they had no idea of the danger that was approaching. Roger had followed leads, investigated rumors, and now he was getting closer and closer to discovering the truth. At Frank's house, Emily watched paralyzed as Roger got out of the car. He walked slowly through the yard, his eyes examining every detail. When he got close to the garden, he stopped, bending down to examine something on the ground. It was one of the adaptations that Frank had made for the wheelchair, a small, almost imperceptible ramp, but which, to eyes trained in the search for clues, was a revealing sign. The smile that formed on Roger's face made Emily tremble. It was the same smile he had that night when he abandoned her on the road, a smile that promised that the nightmare wasn't over yet. Emily's heart was beating so hard that she could hear it echoing in her ears. Through the slit in the curtain, she watched Roger examine every inch of the garden with a meticulous attention that terrified her. Her fingers gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles were white, while her mind screamed in silent panic. Roger stopped in front of the porch, his eyes scanning the adaptations that Frank had made to facilitate access for a wheelchair. His face, normally cold and controlled, now displayed an expression of triumph that made Emily feel nauseous. He knew. Somehow, he had found out. In town, Frank and Martha continued their conversation, completely unaware of the danger that was approaching. The former housekeeper had prepared a strong coffee, and now the two were discussing the details of the past years, connecting pieces of a dark puzzle. "It started soon after he married Susan," Martha explained, her wrinkled hands gripping the coffee cup. "In the beginning, they were small things. A dirty look here, a harsh word there, but always when Susan wasn't around." Frank listened attentively, making mental notes of every detail. "And did you happen to mention anything to your boss?" "I tried to in the beginning," Martha sighed heavily. "But Susan was so happy, you know. After so long alone raising Emily, she had finally found someone. At least that's what she thought." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Frank consulted his own watch and felt a pang of worry. It had been almost 5 hours since he had left Emily alone. At the house, Roger had moved away from the porch and was now walking towards the back of the property. Emily followed him with her eyes, her breath caught in her throat. He stopped again, this time near the clothesline. There were some sheets hanging, and among them, forgotten in the morning's rush, a dress that was obviously too small for an adult. Roger's smile widened, turning his face into a mask of evil that Emily knew all too well. He took his cell phone out of his pocket and made some quick calls, speaking in a voice too low for her to hear. When he finished, he returned to his car, but didn't leave immediately. He stayed there, watching the house like a predator studying its prey. In town, Martha continued revealing details that made Frank's blood boil. In the week before Susan died, I overheard an argument between them. She had discovered something, I don't know exactly what, but she was furious. She threatened to throw him out of the house, said she was going to change her will. Frank felt a chill run down his spine. And soon after that, she died of an aneurysm. Martha made the sign of the cross. It was so sudden. She was perfectly fine the night before. The next morning, when I went to wake her, her voice failed, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "Mrs. Martha," Frank leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "Do you think Susan's death may not have been natural?" Before Martha could answer, Frank's cell phone rang. It was his neighbor, an elderly woman who lived a few miles from his house. "Frank, there's a black car parked in front of your house for almost an hour. I've never seen that car around here before." Frank's blood ran cold. Without waiting to hear the rest, he stood up abruptly. "I need to go. Mrs. Martha, I'll send someone to pick you up later today. Don't stay alone." As he drove back home, Frank felt his heart pounding in his chest. The dirt road seemed endless, each curve a torture. He pressed harder on the accelerator, praying that he would arrive in time. At the house, Emily watched as Roger finally started the car and drove away. But something in his posture, in the way he had smiled before leaving, said that this wasn't a relief. It was just the beginning. Her hands trembled as she maneuvered the chair away from the window. The silence of the house, once comforting, now seemed suffocating. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the curtains made her jump. It was then that she heard it, the unmistakable sound of tires on the dirt road. Her heart leapt, thinking it might be Frank returning. But when she risked looking out the window again, her blood froze in her veins. It wasn't just Roger's car that was coming back. There were 3 other vehicles with him. Men began to get out of the cars, spreading across the yard like menacing shadows. On the road, Frank drove as fast as his old pickup truck would allow. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with orange tones that would normally make him stop to admire the view. But at that moment, the only thing on his mind was getting home. Something in his heart told him that Emily was in danger. Years of experience as a police officer had taught him to trust those instincts, and now all his senses were screaming that something terrible was about to happen. In his house, Emily heard the footsteps approaching. There were several men, moving with a purpose that she knew all too well. Roger wasn't playing anymore. He had come to finish what he had started that stormy night. Her hands trembled as she frantically searched for a place to hide. The sound of glass breaking made her jump. Someone was forcing entry through the back window. "It'll be easier if you don't resist, sweetie." Roger's voice sounded from outside, that falsely sweet tone that she hated so much. "It doesn't have to end like last time." Emily felt the tears stream down her face, but refused to make any noise. She remembered Frank's words that morning. "Be strong, kiddo. You've survived once. You can survive again." The sound of footsteps inside the house was getting closer and closer. Emily could hear the men ransacking the rooms, knocking over furniture, destroying the sanctuary that Frank had created for her. On the road, Frank finally spotted his property. His heart almost stopped when he saw the cars parked in front of his house. He turned off the headlights and stopped the pickup truck at a safe distance, his brain working frantically to formulate a plan. Inside the house, Emily had managed to hide in a small closet in the room that had once belonged to Annie. Through the slits in the door, she could see shadows moving, hear male voices exchanging information. "She has to be here somewhere." Roger's voice sounded increasingly angry. "Turn everything over. I don't want any corner of this house unchecked." Emily's heart was beating so hard that she was sure they could hear it. She closed her eyes tightly, praying silently as her mother had taught her. But this time, it wasn't just for her own salvation that she prayed. It was also for Frank, who had risked everything to protect her. Frank moved silently through the property, years of experience as a police officer guiding his steps. The darkness that was beginning to fall was his ally, allowing him to approach without being noticed. His heart was racing, but his hands were steady. He knew every inch of his land, every shadow, every possible hiding place. Inside the house, Roger's men continued their systematic search. The sound of furniture being dragged and doors being opened violently echoed through the property. In the small closet, Emily breathed as quietly as possible, her hands covering her mouth to muffle any involuntary sound. "Nothing on the first floor, boss," one of the men informed Roger. "We're going upstairs to check the bedrooms." The sound of footsteps on the stairs made Emily's heart race even faster. She was exactly where they were going to look now. Through the slits in the closet, she could see the shadows moving, getting closer and closer. Frank had managed to reach the back porch without being noticed. Through the kitchen window, he could see two men ransacking drawers and cabinets. His blood boiled when he saw the state his house was in: broken furniture, objects scattered on the floor, photographs of Annie thrown carelessly. "There must be some clue here," Roger's voice sounded from upstairs. "That old man couldn't have just disappeared with her like that, without leaving a trace." In the closet, Emily held her breath. The footsteps were getting closer and closer. The door to the room creaked open, and she could see Roger's feet through the lower slit of the closet. "Interesting," she heard him say. "This room seems prepared for someone like her. Look at these adaptations on the walls, this lower bed." Frank took advantage of the men's distraction upstairs to enter the house. With calculated movements, he managed to silently neutralize the two men in the kitchen. Years of police training came back automatically. He knew exactly where to press, to knock them unconscious without making noise. In the bedroom, Roger was getting dangerously close to the closet where Emily was hidden. "You know what's even more interesting?" he continued, his voice loaded with a cruel satisfaction. "The smell. I smell fear in here." Emily closed her eyes tightly, her nails digging into the palms of her hands. The sound of Roger's footsteps stopped right in front of the closet. She could see his shadow through the slits in the door. Frank climbed the stairs carefully, avoiding the steps he knew creaked. He could hear Roger's voice, that falsely sweet tone that made his blood boil. Two more men guarded the hallway. It would be more difficult to get past them without making noise. "You were always a smart girl, Emily," Roger continued, his voice now closer to the closet door. "But this time you've gone too far. You know what happens to kids who cause too much trouble." One of the men in the hallway noticed a movement and turned around, but Frank was already prepared. Years of experience in hand-to-hand combat kicked in. In seconds, the two men were on the floor, neutralized with precise blows. The noise, although muffled, was enough to alert Roger. He turned abruptly, moving away from the closet. "What was that?" "That," Frank's voice sounded from the bedroom door, "was the sound of your luck running out." Roger turned around, his eyes widening as he saw Frank standing in the doorway. For a moment he froze, clearly not expecting to encounter resistance. "So it's you." Roger recovered his composure, a cruel smile forming on his lips. The lonely old man who decided to play hero. "You know you're committing a crime, don't you? Hiding a minor, preventing her from returning to her family." "Family." Frank took a step forward, his voice loaded with controlled rage. Do you call abandoning a child to die on a deserted road family? Evidence, Roger shrugged, still maintaining his air of superiority. You have no proof of any of this. I have influence in this town, connections. Your word against mine. Who do you think they're going to believe? I wouldn't count on that, Frank smiled, a smile that made Roger's confidence waver. You know, in 20 years as a police officer, I learned a few things. For example, always have a plan B. As if on cue, the sound of sirens began to be heard in the distance. Roger ran to the window, his face paling as he saw several patrol cars approaching on the dirt road. Impossible, he murmured, his control finally beginning to crack. How? Martha, Frank explained, his voice now loaded with satisfaction. She's not alone anymore, and she's not afraid of you anymore. The sound of the sirens grew louder, and now you could hear the sound of cars stopping in front of the house. Command voices began to sound outside. It's over, Roger. Frank took another step forward. This time, you're not going to escape. It was then that something changed in Roger's eyes. The mask of civility fell completely, revealing the true face of the monster that had always been there. With a quick movement, he pulled a gun from his jacket. If I'm going down, he snarled, pointing the gun at the closet where he knew Emily was hidden, I'm taking that brat with me. What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion. Frank moved with a speed that didn't match his age, throwing himself at Roger at the exact moment he pulled the trigger. The shot hit the ceiling, while the two men fell to the ground. Emily couldn't contain a scream when she heard the gunshot. The closet door burst open, and she saw Frank and Roger fighting on the floor. The gun had fallen a few yards away. At that moment, police officers stormed into the room, guns drawn. Freeze, police! Roger was immobilized and handcuffed, still shouting threats and curses. Frank stood up with difficulty, a trickle of blood running from a cut on his forehead. Emily, he called, his voice trembling slightly. It's okay, kiddo, you can come out now. Slowly, still trembling, Emily came out of the closet. Her eyes met Roger's, who was still struggling in the hands of the police officers. For the first time, there was no fear in her gaze, only pity. You're never going to hurt anyone again, she said, her voice surprisingly firm. Never again. Martha ran into the room, followed by other police officers. Upon seeing Emily, the woman fell to her knees, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. My girl, she sobbed, hugging Emily. Thank God, thank God. As Roger was led out of the house, still shouting threats, Frank approached Emily and Martha. His face was bruised, but his eyes shone with a mixture of relief and pride. It's over, kiddo, he said softly, placing a hand on Emily's shoulder. Now you're really safe. The sirens were still sounding outside, and command voices still echoed through the property. But there, in that room that once belonged to Annie, 3 people embraced, united by something stronger than blood, united by the courage to face evil and the determination to protect what is right. The days that followed Roger's arrest were intense. The small town in upstate New York was buzzing with the news. The case made headlines in the local newspapers, and the truth finally came to light. Martha gave her testimony, confirming everything she had witnessed that fateful night. Other employees of the supermarkets, encouraged by her example, also began to speak, revealing a pattern of abusive behavior that Roger had maintained for years. The investigation into the death of Susan, Emily's mother, was reopened. Doctors found traces of suspicious substances in tests that had been archived, suggesting that the aneurysm might not have been as natural as initially thought. At Frank's house, life was slowly finding a new rhythm. The marks of the invasion were being erased, furniture repaired, walls painted, photographs put back in their places. But some changes were deeper and more permanent. Emily watched from the porch as Frank worked in the garden, replanting the flowers that had been trampled during the chaos. Martha, who now visited them daily, was in the kitchen preparing a cornmeal cake, filling the house with an aroma that brought sweet memories of the time when Susan was still alive. You know, Frank said, wiping the sweat from his forehead as he sat down beside Emily. Annie loved to see the flowers reborn in the spring. She said it was a reminder that there's always hope, no matter how long the winter lasts. Emily smiled, a genuine smile that now appeared more often. My mother used to say something similar. She always said that God works in mysterious ways. Your mother was a wise woman, Frank commented, his eyes soft as he watched the girl. She would be proud to see how strong you are. The sound of a car approaching made both of them look at the road. There was no more fear in those moments. The times of jolts and scares were behind them. It was just the car of the social worker who came regularly to visit Emily. The woman, a middle-aged lady named Beatrice, got out of the car carrying a folder. Her smile was genuinely happy as she approached the porch. "Good morning," she greeted cheerfully. "I have important news for you." Inside the house, in the room where so many tense moments had been lived, Beatrice opened her folder and began to take out documents. Martha joined them, bringing coffee and the freshly baked cake. "The judge has reviewed the case," Beatrice began, her voice carrying a barely contained emotion. "Considering all the circumstances, Martha's testimony, your record as a police officer, Frank, and especially Emily's well-being." She paused, smiling broadly. "The request for guardianship has been approved." The silence that followed was broken only by the soft sound of the wind in the curtains. Emily looked from Beatrice to Frank, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and hope. "This means," she began, her voice trembling. "This means, kiddo," Frank completed, his own eyes watering, "that this is officially your home now. If you want it, of course." Emily's answer came in the form of tears, but for the first time in a long time, they were tears of joy. Martha, who was already crying openly, hugged the girl tightly. "Your mother is watching this from above," the woman whispered. "I'm sure she's happy that you've found a new dad." The following weeks brought more changes, all of them now for the better. Annie's wheelchair was adjusted perfectly for Emily. The room, which was already adapted, gained personal touches, new photos alongside the old ones, creating a bridge between the past and the present. Frank enrolled Emily in the local school, where she soon began to make friends. Her story had spread, and contrary to what she feared, she didn't find pity in people's eyes. She found admiration for her courage. Martha, who refused to accept any other job, began to divide her time between her own house and Frank's, helping to take care of Emily as she always had. The former housekeeper had become an indispensable part of that peculiar family that fate had brought together. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, a few months later, Frank found Emily in the garden, watching the flowers that were now growing with renewed strength. "What are you thinking about, kiddo?" he asked, sitting down beside her. "About how funny life is," she replied, her voice carrying a maturity that sometimes surprised Frank. "When Roger left me on that road, I thought it was the end. But actually, it was a beginning." Frank nodded, understanding perfectly. "Sometimes we need to lose everything to find what really matters." "You know what else I think?" Emily continued, a small smile playing on her lips. "That Annie must have had something to do with it. Like she guided you to me that night." Frank felt his heart clench with an emotion he couldn't name. "I think about that sometimes too. She always said that nothing happens by chance." At that moment, Martha appeared on the porch, calling them for lunch. The smell of home cooking filled the air, mixing with the perfume of the flowers in the garden. It was an ordinary Sunday, like so many others to come. Emily maneuvered her chair towards the house, Frank walking beside her. They weren't a conventional family. A 10-year-old girl who had faced more pain than any child should, a former police officer who found a new purpose in life, and a former housekeeper who had become a second mother. But there, in that simple house in upstate New York, they had found something precious, a home. Not just a place to live, but a refuge where love, courage, and hope had overcome fear, evil, and loneliness. And every morning when the sun rose, painting the sky pink and gold, it was as if Susan and Annie smiled down from above, blessing that family that had formed from the ashes of tragedy, proving that good, even if it takes time, always wins out in the end.